In Chapter 4, we begin to look at environmental law and policy. We will pursue the following learning outcomes. Discuss concepts used to describe the need for regulation and recognize the alternatives to regulation used to protect the environment. Contrast the different approaches to environmental policy as they have evolved over time. Describe the makeup of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. Evaluate the effectiveness of NEPA. Recognize the shift in approach signified by the Pollution Prevention Act. In an essay published in 1968 by Garrett Hardin, there is a huge, lush pasture open to everyone. Most people make a living raising cattle. Everyone takes their cattle to the common pasture to graze. Each herdsman keeps as many cattle as he can. At some point, there is just enough common to support the cattle. After that point, each additional cattle is a large benefit to one herdsman, but a small cost to all the herdsmen due to the impacts of overgrazing on the shared resource. Each herdsman continues to increase their herd. Thus, the tragedy is that they get locked into a system whereby they are guaranteed to destroy the commons, thus ruin their own chances at success. Ruin is the destination to which all men rush, each pursuing his own interests in society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. The tragedy of the commons applies to environmental law because our environment is a public commons. It can be accessed for the most part by anyone who provides, and it provides many benefits. Pollution by an individual or firm happens because it is cheaper and easier than proper treatments or disposals. And the cost of a degraded environment is shared in fractions by everyone. But these considerations are carried out by so many people that as long as we think and behave as independent free agents, we will exceed the absorptive capacities of our environment. Another reason to have environmental regulation is that resources such as air and water are public goods that are non-excludable and non-rival. This means that consumption of the good by one does not reduce the amount of the good available for consumption by others, and no one can be effectively excluded from using that good. Thus, when someone pays to produce the public good, he or she is not the only one who gets to use it. Free riders are those who do not pay for the good, but do use it. There is a problem if all seek to be free riders. No one but a few irrational saints will be willing to pay for the public good. Because non-rival and non-excludable goods inhibit private markets, either the good will not be produced or the government must act to provide the good. Absent government intervention, our environment will become degraded. Government intervention is also said to eliminate the negative externalities of pollution. An externality is a cost not directly related to production or consumption of a good or service, and not reflected by market prices. Market prices are determined by supply and demand, and interested third parties may be shut out from price determination. This can be seen through an example of pollution. If production of a widget creates pollution, the producer could choose to pay to clean up the pollution and reflect the cleanup cost in their prices. However, if a third party, such as the citizens who were negatively impacted by pollution but are not buying the widget, has no voice, and this cost is not imposed on the producer, pollution will continue. One common justification for any government intervention in the market is to eliminate negative externalities. In the market, buyers and sellers interact to determine prices for goods and services. Buyers, through demand, communicate that certain resources should be allocated to the production of certain goods. Price is supposed to reflect the interest in allocation of resources to the production of those goods. However, sometimes third parties have an interest in a good or service, but the market listens only to the buyers and sellers. Third parties have no impact on market prices. Either government gives their interests a voice in production decisions, or they have no voice. Thus, some argue that the government needs to step in and impose the cost of pollution on the polluting firm so that it will have to increase the price of the product to reflect the true cost of producing the product. If the producer must pay to properly dispose of the hazardous waste created by producing the product, citizens who have otherwise been adversely affected by the improper use will not have to pay by incurring losses to their health. The important point here is that the marketplace by itself does not have a mechanism for providing public goods such as clean water and accounting for the cost of externalities, such as the cost for third parties associated with improper waste disposal. True cost pricing is not likely to happen without regulations that require it. An ethic is a moral code of right or wrong. Environmental ethics are guided by ecology and other sciences, philosophy, and even religion. Environmentalists often refer to the environment as a part of an ecological system. Each part of the land affects another part, and changes over time result in evolution. A concern is that human beings are changing the system too quickly for it to adjust, and that we do not know the consequences of our changes. Other arguments allow that humans have a responsibility to care for our environment because we are the most aware, dominant Earth species, because we have a duty toward future generations to be good stewards of resources, and because we do not have a right to use the Earth for small, selfish whims that destroy it. Noblesse oblige means privileged people have a responsibility to act with generosity and nobility toward those that are less privileged. In the environmental arena, this refers to the responsibility of humans as species toward other species and the environment. Direct regulation sets standards and mandates compliance with punishment, usually fines, for violation of standards. These standards may be on technologies used or emissions allowed. This kind of regulation is called command and control or end of pipe. It attempts to control the pollution at the end of the process rather than preventing emissions. To date, most environmental law has been a form of direct regulation, but the hope is that we will reduce the amount of pollution created from the start. Besides regulations, the primary means of pollution control has traditionally been tort law. Tort law is when actions are carried out for a civil wrong that was done. Traditionally, this transpired through nuisance cases for unreasonable interferences with the use and enjoyment of another person's property. Person A polluted the air or water on land that was used and enjoyed by person B. So person B would sue person A and get an injunction or a court order for the pollution to stop. There may also be monetary damages awarded, but courts can decide that the cost of the injunction outweighs the cost of the harm or nuisance, granting only permanent damages and allowing pollution to continue. This displays another issue with tort law. It reacts to existing problems rather than preventing them. The example above is of a private nuisance because it affects a limited number of people, or in this case, one person in a unique way, which gives them standing to sue. Most pollution, however, is classified as a public nuisance because it affects a large number of people. Only a public official can sue for public nuisance, but officials may be reluctant to risk their elected position or popularity. Furthermore, it may be difficult to prove that any one polluter caused certain harms, especially when bringing an action can be expensive. A shift toward pollution prevention has led to adopting more market-based strategies, including the use of subsidies, emissions charges, and marketable emissions permits. When the government pays grants or tax credits to encourage pollution control, it is considered a subsidy. Subsidies are more effective when a polluter anticipates having to pay cleanup costs anyway, so they do it more immediately while the cost can be reduced. Desire to beat competitors may inhibit the success of subsidies because a firm does not want to pay any costs that the competitors do not. This reflects a focus on short-term effects. Consumers can also benefit from subsidies through tax credits for energy efficiency or renewable energy technology purchases. When users are charged a fee per unit of pollution emitted, it is considered an emissions charge. A larger fee per unit emitted should curtail the pollution. However, levels of emission and effective fees are hard to calculate and implement. Another solution is for the government to sell permits and let polluters trade these among each other. These are called marketable emission permits or cap and trade. A total pollution target or limit is set by the government. Permits that meet the target goals are issued. Firms that reduce their emissions can then sell their permits to firms who exceeded their own limits. The total emissions limit is decreased by decreasing the cap over time based on agreed upon goals. Environmental taxes, or green taxes, extract money from polluters and channel the revenue into environmental programs. This may correct marketplace failure to value ecosystem services and may discourage polluting behaviors. The EU has had some success with green taxes for waste disposal, carbon, and energy sources. The US imposed one for chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, and Boulder, Colorado passed the first carbon tax in the United States in 2006. With respect to business and other affairs, the United States government policy has traditionally been laissez-faire, or free from government interference. Policy creation is subject to laborious legislative processes as well as cultural and economic values. There was a lack of environmental policy because there was little scientific knowledge or computer technology to understand our environmental problems. Environmental policy today is an example of national rather than laissez-faire policy, and it is marked early on by the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, NEPA. In the 1970s, American culture reflected a desire for a cleaner environment maintained by responsible citizens and firms. Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb, and Barry Commoner put out Closing the Circle. These books centered around ecological principles of chain effects and resource use. There was a disastrous oil spill in 1969 in Santa Barbara, California. The first Earth Day was in 1970, generated huge public pressure on politicians to form regulations. The EPA was created, NEPA was passed, and in this decade, 27 laws and countless rules improved environmental quality. In the 1980s, declining economic conditions and the Reagan administration combined to push for cutting cost and thus cutting regulation. Conservative agency appointments reduced staffs and budgets, and an initially compliant Congress worked to give business more wiggle room. However, public disapproval of this direction soon pushed Congress to re-strengthen environmental laws and programs. In the early 1990s, interest in environmental protections continued to rise. Green products rose in popularity. However, there was a conflict within George H.W. Bush's administration. Conservative courts and a declining economy also contributed to concerns over regulation costs. With major gains already obtained, more regulation resulted in smaller gains, and more parties called for cost-effective ways to prevent pollution. In 1992, President Clinton and Vice President Gore were elected. They were called environmental extremists by opponents. The Democratic administration challenged businesses to evaluate their own compliance and anticipate enforcement. In 1994, House control was given to the Republicans, who pushed for regulatory reform in such a way that benefited private ownership of property and business. This idea became known as the Contract with America, and it had frightening environmental implications. However, little of this legislation was passed in 1996. By the end of the 1990s, Republicans appeared to embrace public support for environmental protection, but there were still congressional attempts to halt that protection. President Clinton used the end of his term to pass environmental regulations through executive orders, which were stopped by President Bush when he stepped into office. The 1990s marked a shift toward use of market force strategies to encourage pollution prevention. This trend saw pollution as a sign of inefficiency or externalities, which would be economic problems in addition to environmental problems. Incentives were developed to reduce pollution. Bottle bills required certain drinks to be sold in recyclable or reusable bottles, and they were paid for by consumers via a deposit, but consumers are refunded the bottle when it's returned via recycling. A similar system may be used for hazardous materials. Paying for trash pickup and pollution taxes are incentives to produce less waste. In other words, these incentives enforce a polluter pays concept. Consumers could also be provided with better product information, pressuring manufacturers to make better products. Voluntary programs encouraged partnerships with regulated entities in order to display proactive environmental leadership. A good example of this is the Energy Star program. Under the authority of the Clean Air Act, discussed later in the course, the Energy Star program identifies and promotes energy-efficient products and buildings to reduce energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. The ISO 14000 is a set of international environmental standards that businesses can choose to meet. It includes management systems, which are covered in the 14001 certification, auditing, performance evaluation, life cycle analysis, and labeling. Meeting certain ISO standards has actually become a condition for trading with many international companies. The George W. Bush administration acted to remove and reduce environmental protections, shifting back to support private rights and industry. This was illustrated by his cabinet appointments, which are detailed in the displayed image of EPA administrative history. There was evident conflict with the appointment of Christine Todd Whitman, who resigned just as a significant number of EPA employees did, frustrated by presidential goals that clashed with environmental protection. Today, environmental policy is a political, legal, and constitutional issue. There are challenges to environmental regulations based on where authority is derived. States have also taken more active roles as well, often imposing more stringent standards than the federal government. Perceiving this, environmental groups have financially contributed more to state candidates. The Obama administration started off promising, but actual action during the first term was less than stellar, largely due to concerns over the economy and job availability. Further, gridlock between his executive branch and the legislature did not allow for much progress via statutes. However, in recent years, Obama and his EPA relied on executive actions and agency rulemaking powers to move forward in initiatives important to his goals. We're very early in the Trump administration, and so the impacts of the deregulatory approach are not yet resolved. NEPA was enacted in 1970. More of a planning than an implementation statute, it created the Council of Environmental Quality, enables and requires federal agencies to make environmental considerations, and requires an environmental impact statement for certain major federal actions. Sometimes called a federal watchdog, the Council on Environmental Quality has 3 members with 1 chair. The chair also attends President's Domestic Policy Council meetings, international conferences, and federal agency activities. The CEQ uses data, national progress, and legislation recommendations to advise the President on environmental issues. They regulate NEPA procedures and EIS requirements. EIS is Environmental Impact Statements. The CEQ also has a number of other advisory and oversight functions. An environmental impact statement is required for any federal activity involving major resource commitment and having a significant impact on the human environment. These phrases are unclear, but Significant impact has been defined by the CEQ using context and intensity. Context is both short and long-term and includes local, regional, and societal effects. Intensity involves 10 factors that are related to the degree of potential or real effects. Even so, knowing whether to file an EIS can be difficult. The EIS has 5 required elements. Number 1, positive and negative impacts of the proposed action. Number 2, unavoidable adverse impacts assuming implementation. Number 3, alternatives to the proposed action, including doing nothing. Number 4, relationship between short-term environmental uses and long-term productivity increases. And 5, irreversible resource commitments. Filing an EIS takes time and resources. A team must draft and review the assessment. The CEQ must review and comment on the draft, which then goes to the Federal Register for public comment. A highly criticized draft can force the agency to fix it or start over completely to avoid legal consequences later on. The final draft is published in the Federal Register. It can still be challenged, but courts typically allow an EIS to stand if proper procedures were followed. Forcing an EIS requirement through litigation must take court jurisdiction and political timing into consideration. If the court rules that the EIS is inadequate, it can only order a temporary injunction until an adequate EIS is followed. At this point, the project may have been modified or dropped, or public opposition may have been raised. The number of challenges to EISs has only increased since the 1970s and 80s. EPA ratings are used to evaluate an EIS. Lack of objections, LO, means that there were no potential impacts found to substantially change the proposal. Environmental concerns, EC, means that there are impacts that should be avoided to fully protect the environment. Environmental objective, EO, means that there are significant impacts that must be avoided to adequately protect the environment. Environmentally unsatisfactory, or EU, means that there are adverse impacts that are unsatisfactory for public health. An agency can also file a finding of no significant impact, or FONSI, with an environmental assessment, EA, if they believe that the EIS is not necessary. An environmental assessment, EA, is more concise and has become more popular than an EIS. It analyzes and determines impact significance of federal actions. If there are no significant impacts, an EIS is not needed and the EA is sufficient proof. If an agency finds potential impacts and must mitigate its action, a FONSI can be filed. Overall, the CEQ has determined that EIS implementation has fallen short of some goals. Reasons for this include the time, cost, and technical documents necessary for the NEPA procedures. However, NEPA has still been a model for other governing bodies, and there have been changes proposed and made to NEPA since its establishment. The Pollution Prevention Act of 1990 was an attempt to diverge from end-of-pipe regulation. Congress recognized that industry can produce or prevent pollution by cost-effective measures. That this was not being done due to the focus on the treatment and disposal, and that the source reduction is preferable to management and control. The Act requires prevention or reduction where possible, recycling when the previous solution is not possible, and safe treatment when that fails, and pollution release when all else fails. There is an office within the EPA to administer the Act, and the administrator must write a report every other year. The Act provides matching grants for state programs that support source reduction and technologies by businesses. Since the Act was passed, there have been executive orders and other programs that target pollution prevention. There are 6 steps outlined in the EPA for setting up a pollution prevention program. This is the summary of the original EPA fact sheet. 1. demonstrate management support of pollution prevention as an organizational goal. 2, itemize and systematize waste generation and management goals. 3, conduct pollution prevention assessments so that the waste prevention is continually sought. 4, allocate true costs of waste management to the responsible generating activities through a cost allocation system. 5, transfer to different technologies. 6, review the program for feedback and improvement. Green initiatives are policies and regulations meant to encourage the federal government to sustainably purchase things or develop business practices. The EPA has made efforts within its own structure to this end. EPA strategies involve facilities and operations, an environmental management system, and its green initiatives for electronics.